This is Social Psychology Online, the Self. So, social psychologists are primarily interested in the effects of the situation on people's affect, behavior, and cognition. We know that situations influence people's behavior. We have experience with this. For example, when you come into a classroom, there's a particular set of rules that apply to how you as a student behave in that particular classroom. But it's not just the situation that influences behavior, it's people's personalities as well. And Kurt Lewin, who is often considered the father of modern social psychology, used to contends that a person's behavior is a function of who they are interacting with the environment that they're in. So for example, I ask these questions. Let's say you're at a Bears game and it's at noon and you're drinking a beer. Well, why do you drink a beer at noon? Is it because of social norms? Is it because of advertising? Right? You wouldn't drink a beer at noon if you were sitting in my classroom, or if it's noon right now, you're not drinking a beer while you're listening to this, right? We'll talk about this idea of social norms. One theme that we're going to come across in this class, though, is that people are not necessarily always aware of why they do the things that they do. People are typically very good at coming up with justifications for their behavior, but they don't necessarily understand all of the influences on their behavior from day to day. This is sort of a reference back to the perception is more important than objective reality, in that people's perceptions can influence this kind of behavior. So when we talk about the self, there's a couple important terms to recognize or to understand. So first is the idea of the self-concept. The self-concept is a representation of who you are. You can think of this as an overall representation of how you see yourself. And this includes both schemas and self-esteem. So you can think about these next two as sort of falling underneath this overarching category of your self-concept. A schema is a knowledge structure. You can think about it as a way of organizing factual information. It's all the information that you have about a particular idea or a topic, and all the attributes and its relationships with other concepts. So for example, if I say the word zoo, you have a schema of what a zoo is. And when I say the word zoo in your brain, all the things that you think about related to zoos becomes activated. So this is your schema of zoo. Now we have a particular self-schema, which represents all the beliefs, facts, ideas that compromise or compose your self-concept, or sort of the cognitive portion of who you think you are. And this is based on your experiences and the stories that you sort of tell yourself, and the way that you sort of behave in the world. Now, self-schemas can include generalizations, so I might say like I'm organized, or specific facts like I'm a professor, I live in Chicago. They can include events. I ran the marathon. At the time that I'm recording this, I'm training for the Olympic Chicago Triathlon, right? But these are all statements of fact, beliefs about who I am. I am a father. I am a runner. I am a nerd, these sorts of things. They're really important because of the way that neural networks and self-schemas work. When you activate the self, you activate all of the knowledge structures that you have attached to your sense of self. So for example, going back to the zoo example, when I say the word zoo, all of the things that you think of relating to zoos become activated in your brain, so that you can easily call up information about that time you were at the zoo when you were a kid, or the fact that zoos smell really bad and you don't like them, or whatever this is. The same thing is true of the self. right? If I see an advertisement where there's a person running, that activates in my brain my sense of self, because I have attached to my sense of self the idea of being a runner. Other things about the self that are important is that these self schemas, these beliefs, these cognitive facts about the self, they guide behavior and they're resistant to persuasion. Like, you are not going to convince me to stop running. Even if I went to the doctor and the doctor told me that my knees were shot and I should probably stop running, I would probably still keep running, right? They're resistant to persuasion. Our sense of self is also influenced by some other factors, and I'll refer to these throughout the course as the ABCs of social psychology: affect, behavior, and cognition, right? You can think of self-schemas as the cognitive side, right? These are beliefs, these are facts. But there's also this affective side and this behavioral side of the self. So if you think of self-schemas as being beliefs, this is sort of the cognitive component, then self-esteem is the feeling component, right? It's the affective component, right? It's not statements of fact about who you are or what you do, but it's your feeling of how much you like or dislike different aspects of yourself. Now, some people have higher self-esteem, some people have lower self-esteem. Again, think back to that normal distribution we talked about last time. Self-esteem can vary, but there are different ways to looking at self-esteem. We can talk about trait self-esteem, which is a global evaluation of how we see yourself. Overall, I feel that I have a number of good qualities. Overall, I am satisfied with myself, right? These are questions that sort of get at this idea of this overall self-esteem. Overall, how do you feel about yourself? You can also look at state self-esteem. Now, state self-esteem is not overall, but it's about right now. How do you feel about yourself in this particular moment? We expect, generally speaking, more variability in state self-esteem than trait self-esteem. Your trait self-esteem is going to be relatively stable over a period of time. But your state self-esteem, how you feel about yourself in this particular moment on this particular day, probably is going to vary, depending on the kind of day you've had and the kind of week you've had and those sorts of things. But it's an important distinction, this sort of trait versus state self-esteem. Now, when we talk about emotions, right, we talk about self-esteem as being the emotional aspect of the self, how you feel about yourself. But we need to talk briefly about emotions themselves. So an emotion is a psychological state that has both physiological and cognitive components. And Mandler, way back in the 1970s, says this can sometimes result in the interruption of or the achievement of some kind of goal, right? So we feel good when we achieve something, and we feel bad when we're prevented from achieving something, right? Now, emotions have these two pieces, the physiological and the cognitive. Now, when we say physiological arousal, I'm talking about sympathetic nervous system arousal. The way that I sort of describe this, or the way to sort of think about this is, if you've ever been in Chicago, imagine yourself in Chicago and you are taking the train, the CTA somewhere late at night, and it's just you and some other person on a train, and they're kind of a creeper, they're kind of weird looking, and they happen to get off at the same stop as you in the middle of the night, and you start getting nervous. You're like, oh no, is this person following me? Right? That physiological feeling, that's physiological arousal, and it can vary from very low arousal to very extreme arousal, like that sort of fight or flight response that you're experiencing there. Now, layered on top of that is your subjective experience of that emotion, your interpretation of what does this physiological arousal mean. Does it mean that I'm scared? Does it mean that I'm angry? Does it mean that I'm ready to fight this person who's chasing me off the train or following me off the train, right? So an emotion involves these two different parts. And it sort of begs this question, like this sort of chicken and egg question, like, Is it that we smile because we are happy, or are we happy because we smile, right? Do happy feelings produce the affective display of happiness, or could we simply smile and that could cause us to feel happier internally, right? And this really is a big fundamental question. Does this physiological arousal piece of the emotion come before or after our emotional experience? So there were a variety of studies that addressed this back in the 60s, but the Schachter and Singer study is by far my favorite and most amazing example of this kind of cool experimental design. So they asked the question, what happens when you experience physiological arousal but you can't explain why? And so what they did was they tested the effects of vitamin injections on visual skills. And what they actually did was they brought participants into the lab and they had them get an injection of some sort. And they told these participants, well, this is a vitamin injection. But half of the participants received an adrenaline shot. And adrenaline causes physiological arousal, right? So they actually injected people with adrenaline. This is back in the 1960s when, you could just do that. You could just inject people with hormones and that was okay, right? But they injected these people with adrenaline. And the other people were injected with adrenaline as well. And what they manipulated was their knowledge of the adrenaline. So some people were told, we're giving you these vitamin injections and you're going to feel this specific set of symptoms. And these symptoms are associated with adrenaline, right? You're going to have increased heart rate, sweaty palms, feelings of sort of jitteriness or whatever. But the other group, they were told nothing, right? They were told, we're giving you this vitamin injection, whatever. And then, of course, there was a control group as well that didn't receive any injection. Now, here's where this gets interesting. So you have these two groups of people, the people who've been injected with adrenaline and told these are the side effects of adrenaline, and the people who've been injected with adrenaline and have not been told the side effects. And what they did was they said, okay, before we do the next part of the study, we want you to go into this other room. And in this other room, they were randomly assigned to an emotional experience condition, either euphoria or anger. And the way that they manipulated this was with a confederate. Now, a confederate is a person who works for the researcher and is part of the experimental design. And what they did was they had this confederate in the euphoria room behaving in a euphoric manner. Confederate was really excited. He loved doing this. He was filling out the survey. He was making paper airplanes and playing basketball with, little water pieces of paper and just having a blast, having a great time, right? Modeling this euphoric behavior. For the participants in the anger condition, the confederate was just frankly pissed off, was really upset, was complaining about all the questions that they had to fill out in the survey, right? And they were just really, really upset, conveying anger. Okay. And then what they did was after they were injected with adrenaline and either told or not told about the effects, and then put into either an anger or euphoria condition, right, being exposed to this person who was, displaying these emotions, they measured the emotional responses of the participants. And what they found was that the participants who were told about the effects of the adrenaline, they had an explanation for why they were feeling the way that they were feeling. And so they weren't any more or less angry depending on whether they were in the room with the angry or happy confederate. But the interesting thing about this study is for the adrenaline ignorant people, the people who'd gotten the shot of adrenaline, but they had no explanation for why they were feeling what they were feeling, for those people, they reported significantly more happiness in the euphoria condition and significantly more anger in the anger condition, right? And so what this suggests is that the physiological response comes before the affective experience, right? In essence, we experience some physiological arousal and then we label this with an emotional experience. one thing to know about physiological arousal is that physiological arousal is all basically the same. The physiological response you have to almost getting hit by a car is the same physiological response that you have when you are excited about a romantic encounter you're about to have. Right? And the difference between these things is the label that we put on this. Right? When the car is coming at you, that arousal we label as fear. When you're about to get romantic with a partner, that arousal we label as, sexual arousal. So what this suggests then is that physiological arousal precedes our cognitive interpretation of that emotional experience. Dutton and Aaron did another study very similar to this, where they looked at the effects of physiological arousal on whether or not men would ask out an attractive female lab assistant. And what they did was they set up their research study in front of one of two bridges, right? The bridges were either this very scary looking bridge, right? This sort of suspension bridge across a very large, deep gorge, or this bridge, which was a very safe sort of concrete bridge, right? Now, presumably, crossing over the scary suspension bridge is going to induce more physiological arousal than crossing over the concrete, bridge that's capable of holding up, regular car traffic. And what they did was they had an attractive female lab assistant pose at the end of one of these bridges, and they asked men to fill out this survey. And at the bottom of the survey, the female lab assistant said to these men, "By the way, if you have any questions about the survey, here's my personal phone number. Please feel free to give me a call." And what they measured was the number of men who took that as an indication that they might want to go out on a date with this attractive woman, that she was sort of giving them an opening to call her for a date. And they looked at the number of men who called for a date, and what they found was that significantly more men called to arrange a date with a lab assistant after they had crossed the scary bridge compared to when they had crossed the safe bridge, right? And what they talk about this as is misattribution of emotional arousal. The men who crossed over the scary bridge, right, they attributed their physiological arousal to attraction to this woman, right? And that led them to be more likely to call for a date. And again, at the end of the day, whether you're on a roller coaster or enjoying a romantic evening, the physiological arousal is more or less as similar across these emotional experiences. Now, there are different brain structures associated with different emotions, and we'll talk about this later, but the physiological piece of this, not the cognitive piece, but the physiological piece is effectively the same. So we've talked about the cognitive aspect of the self. We've talked about the affective aspect of the self in terms of self-esteem, and also about the basic functions of emotions. The biology of emotions. But there's one thing that is nearly universal across almost everyone, and that is we are motivated to see ourselves in the most favorable light possible. In other words, people generally like themselves, as a rule. They show a dramatic positivity bias on every dimension almost imaginable. So if I ask you, how good are you at something? How many of you are excellent drivers, right? Most people think of themselves as excellent drivers, but statistically speaking, in a classroom full of 20 students, half of you guys are going to be below average drivers, right? But people like to view themselves in the most possible light possible. I just said most possible light possible. Most favorable light possible. Now, there's different ways that we can self-enhance. So this can be through self-serving cognitions, right? If we think that there's a positivity bias when we consider ourselves, that means our self-schema is positively biased. So when I ask you, tell me about your strengths and weaknesses, and that activates your sense of self, you're going to be able to think of a lot more strengths than weaknesses. You're going to think that you're above average. People can also self-handicap, so they can take actions to make success difficult, so they have excuses for failure, right? So if you procrastinate because you've got this, very scary statistics test coming up, and then you don't end up studying for the test, right? And you fail the test, you've self-handicapped, because you can say, well, the reason why I failed the test is just because, because I, had to work and I had all these other things. I just didn't have time to study, right? And this allows you to avoid or provide an alternative explanation for why you did poorly on the test, allowing you to sort of maintain your positive bias of the self. So you augment your success and you diminish your failure. Of course, when people do this, though, you do actually risk failing, and people don't necessarily like people who are always making excuses for things. So there's some risk involved in this. Other ways that we self-enhance, berging, basking in reflected glory. So this is when we associate ourselves with positive situations. So the most common example of this is having to do with sports teams. If you go to any college campus, and this is a profound effect that's been replicated multiple times, if you go to any college campus, following a sports team win, the people on campus are going to wear significantly more sports apparel. This is sort of like hats and jerseys and jackets and whatever, compared to when that sports team loses, right? When the sports team wins, we want to associate ourselves with that because that enhances our sense of self. When the team loses, though, we engage in the opposite aspect of this, Korfing, cutting off reflected failure, or disassociating ourselves with groups and people who are failures, right? We want to, when our team loses, when we're waking up the next morning and our team has just lost, right, that makes it much more likely we're going to go ahead and put on that White Sox jersey or that Cubs jersey or that Benedictine University hat. Another way that we can self-enhance is by making downward social comparisons, right? This is sort of the reason why people love watching Maury Povich on some level, or those kinds of daytime talk shows, right? We can make ourselves feel better by comparing ourselves to people who are worse off than us, right? And we'll talk a lot more about this, right? But one way to feel better about yourself, right, is to think of someone who is worse off than you in some dimension. Right? Well, I might not be rich, but at least I'm, doing better than this person. That kind of thing. So, we've talked about self-schema. We've talked about what is your sort of sense of self. We've talked about some aspects of the self, like we like to see ourselves in a positive light. But how do we know who we are? Right? There's a few different theoretical approaches to this. So some can be sort of looking at yourself introspectively, thinking about who you are, and some can be by paying attention to the way that other people treat you. So self-perception theory suggests that we know ourselves by observing our attitudes and behaviors, by paying attention to what we do. But there's some problems with this, right? If I can get you to do something without you knowing it, I can actually get you to change your sense of self, right? So for example, if I bring you into my lab and you have zero opinion about tacos, like you could care less one way or another about tacos, and I sit down and I say, what I'd like you to do is just imagine you're preparing for a debate and you've been assigned to write an essay about the virtues of tacos, and I have you sit down and write all about how much you love tacos. You will eventually come to like tacos more because there's a motivation to be consistent with your behavior. You observe your behavior. I just wrote this entire essay about why tacos are amazing. And so now I'm like, do you like tacos? You're like, yeah, they're not bad, right? I like tacos more than I did before. Okay. Now this is especially true where you are less certain of who you are, or where you have relatively weak attitudes, or these concepts are weakly tied to your sense of self. If you put hates tacos on your I am list, like if I ask you, list out all the things that identify who you are, and the first thing on your list is I hate tacos, then obviously this isn't going to work, right? Having you write an essay about how much you love tacos isn't going to change anything, right? But through this self-perception, right, if we observe our behaviors, we can actually change our sense of self to be consistent with the behavior that we're engaging in, even if someone is just asking us to engage in that behavior in the first place. It's not even something we willfully chose to do. So you can also think deeply about who you are, but generally speaking, this is bad. People are generally really bad at predicting their future emotional states. If I say, think about how terrible you will feel if you get into a car accident tomorrow and you are paraplegic and can no longer walk. Or if I say, think about how happy you will be if you won the lottery tomorrow and you had all of a sudden, an annuity of $30,000 deposited into your bank account every single month, right? People are generally almost always exaggerating how they think they would feel, right? You think you would feel much worse if you were paralyzed. You think you would be much happier if you won the lottery. But typically we tend to return to our baseline level of happiness, right? You might be happy in the short term if you win the lottery, or sad in the long term or short term if you're paralyzed. But over the course of time, you'll sort of return to that sort of average level of happiness. And so it suggests that we're not really necessarily good at understanding who we are just by introspecting alone. Another problem with this has to do with the problem of memory, right? Memory is full of biases. One thing we'll talk about in this class is that memory is an act of recreation. So it's when you remember something, it's not like you're sort of opening a file on a computer and just looking at what you wrote before and then closing that file. When you remember something, your brain is activating the unique pattern of neurological activity that was active at the time that you experienced that memory. And the only way that your brain knows that you are not actually experiencing that thing is that the sensory information you're getting from your body tells you that you are here right now, and this thing that you are thinking about is actually a memory, right? So remembering is an act of recreation, and because of that, it is full of biases. We tend to think of things more positively than they are. We remember ourselves as being more consistent than we are. We remember all situations from our own perspective and thus see ourselves as being more central in these kinds of situations. And this gets worse as you age. So memory is not a good way to know yourself. And in fact, we'll talk about biases in memory throughout the quarter or throughout the term. So the take-home message is we are really bad at understanding ourselves. All right, I can get you to change who you are by changing your behavior, and then you'll think of yourself to be consistent with those new behaviors. We don't have really good insight into what causes us to do what we do, but when we ask people, why did you do what you did, we're really pretty good at coming up with reasons, right, for why we did what we did. And we are influenced by wanting to see ourselves too favorably. So another way that we can get to know who we are is through what we talk about as reflected appraisals, or this is information that we get from other people about who we are. So this is inferences that we make about the way that people respond to us, perhaps stereotype-based information about groups that we're associated with. And this is especially true when we get this information, we get consistent information from many people. Well, so if everyone that you know tells you that you are super attractive, then you are going to incorporate that sense of attractiveness into your sense of self, like I am an attractive person. Or conversely, if people treat you consistently as unattractive, then you may incorporate that into your sense of self. This is similar for other dimensions too. So you can imagine a child growing up. If everyone who is you are exposed to as a child tells you you're smart, you're good at math, then you will incorporate that into your sense of self. And conversely, if everyone that you know growing up tells you you are stupid or you are bad at math, then you will incorporate that into your sense of self. So, for example, chimpanzees will actually only develop a sense of self when they are raised around other chimps. And you might ask yourself, like, how do we know that chimpanzees have self-concept? And the way that we do this is with a little red lipstick spot. And what they do is they take a little red lipstick spot and they put it on a chimp's forehead, and then they put the chimp in front of a mirror. And chimps, or babies, that are raised around other chimps develop a self-concept, an idea that they are distinct from other people or other animals. And so chimps raised around other chimps, when they look in the mirror, they see that red dot and they recognize that that is them and not someone else, and they'll actually poke. You can't see me right now, but I'm poking my forehead. They'll actually poke at that red dot to try and figure out what that is. And that knowledge, the fact that they're aware that that is on their own forehead, implies that they have a sense of self. In contrast, chimps raised in isolation don't have that sense of self. They don't sort of poke at that red dot in that study. Now, we can also get information by comparing our successes and failures to other people. Generally speaking, if we compare downward, we feel better. If we compare upward, we feel worse, right? So if I think about my life and my situation, like as a college professor, like I'm doing okay. You know, I've got a roof over my head, I've got a mortgage, and I've got, you know, I pay my bills and all that. And, you know, if I compare myself to people who are worse off than me, people who are homeless, people maybe who are struggling, right, I might feel really good about my situation. But if I compare myself to people who are better than me, it's like I compare myself to Mitt Romney's kids or Donald Trump's kids, right? You know, I don't have a vacation home. I certainly don't have a jet ski or a yacht. And if I compare upwards like that, I might feel bad about myself. Classic study, Mr. Clean and Mr. Dirty. They had students interviewing for a job, and in the waiting room, they manipulated the person that they were waiting with. Either they were waiting for this job interview next to someone, Mr. Clean, who was like in a really well-dressed suit and just looked really good, or they were in the waiting room with Mr. Dirty, right? A person who was very disheveled looking and kind of, you know, a little funk smell to him and just didn't really look very good. And the students who were waiting with Mr. Clean felt bad. They felt like they had a worse chance of getting this job compared to people who were waiting with Mr. Dirty. They felt good. They felt like they had a better chance of getting this job. And again, the reason was because they were comparing their selves and their prospects to this person in the room, this social comparison, right? Most people would rather do poorly but better than others than do well but be worse than other people. Or in other words, most people would rather be a big fish in a small pond as opposed to a bigger fish but in a much, much, much gianter pond. And I don't think gianter is a word, but we'll go with it. So, how do you know yourself? Self-perception, introspection, memory, generally not the best. The way that other people treat you and how you compare yourself to others, other ways that we know ourselves. One thing about the self is that we're not always self-aware. There are certain circumstances that will make us more or less self-aware. We'll talk later on about groups and how that makes us, that can reduce our sense of self-awareness. Mirrors, cameras, those sorts of things, those can make us feel self-aware. So for example, if you've ever been in downtown Chicago, on many street corners, they have these police boxes with cameras on them and bright flashing blue lights, right? And you'd think to yourself, like, why would the police go to all the trouble to make it so obvious that there was a police camera on the corner? Well, the reason is they want you to be made self-aware. They want you to be aware that you are being watched, right? Because when you are being watched, you are more likely to behave yourself than when you are not being watched. We'll talk about this sort of self-awareness as we go through. People who are self-focused, like self-focused people in general, people who pay really close attention to their sense of self all the time, are more likely to be in a bad mood. They're more likely to be depressed. There's this great study where they had people come into a room and they either did nothing, so they just sat in the room, or they watched a movie, or they sat in front of a mirror, and they measured the amount of time that they spent in there. And what they found was the people who were in front of the mirror were in there for longer and reported lower self-esteem than the people in the Western or the people who did nothing, right? And the idea was that the people who watched the Western were able to avoid sort of introspecting about themselves, right? And this led them to have higher self-esteem. And part of this is self-awareness can trigger self-evaluation, right? If you start thinking about who you are, you start thinking about your life, and you start introspecting on, the things that you've accomplished and not accomplished, and your successes and failures and your misgivings and those sorts of things. And so being self-focused can actually lead to self-evaluation. So when we have self-awareness, we can shape up or ship out. There's different ways that we deal with this. One is by behaving in ways that are consistent with our ideal self, right? Behaving in morally ideal ways, or behaving in ways that are consistent with our worldview and ideals. So in the Halloween study, this is super fun. One Halloween, researchers put out a bowl of candy on the front porch of a house, and they put a sign next to the bowl that said, take one, and then they randomly assigned people to one of two conditions. Either there was a sign that said take one piece of candy, or there was that sign that said take one piece of candy, and there was a mirror in front of or behind the bowl of candy, so that the kids could actually physically see themselves. And what they found was that when the kids had to look into a mirror and see themselves, they were much less likely to take extra candy than when there was no mirror. When there was no mirror, as you'd expect, kids were taking candy by the handfuls. So that's this idea of being self-aware and behaving in a way that's consistent with our ideal sense of self. If you've ever been at Walgreens or a CVS and you walk through the makeup aisle, in many Walgreens and CVS, they'll have a little alarm that goes off that lets you know that someone has been alerted to your presence, right? And why do they do that? Why do they have a TV in the store that shows you that you are on camera, right? Because seeing yourself on camera makes you less likely to steal. Right? It makes you more self-aware, and that makes you more worried about getting caught, or might make you more concerned with behaving in a way that's consistent with a positive sense of who you are. Lastly, so we can either change our behavior to make it more consistent with our ideal self, or we can just escape the situation. So in this Duval study that's super fun, they made people self-aware with this bogus success or failure feedback. So they brought people into the lab, they had them do this task that was supposed to be indicative of their personality, something having to do with who they are. And either they told them they did really well, or they did them really terribly, or they did really terribly on the task. And they put them in front of a mirror to wait for the second part of the study. But the second part of the study was actually just measuring how long they would sit in front of the mirror. And what they found was that the people who failed and sat in front of the mirror left the quickest, right? So when people were forced with failure and then forced to stare at themselves, to think about themselves, they ended up leaving the fastest. Right? So there are other ways that we can do this. So we can distract ourselves with drugs and alcohol. We can remind ourselves about other good qualities. Well, I'm self-aware and I'm really failing in this aspect of my life, but I'm really great at this other aspect. You can lower your standards, these sorts of things. So that is the self. As always, make sure you're working on this unit's quizzes and email me if you have any questions.